All right, welcome to the Argonaut review of 2024. Had a really nice year. First, really quick on the Argonaut project, we're just an implementation community looking to advance FHIR and OAuth. Our membership has been pretty stable, and so I think the best way to get to know us, I think, is through our members and through our projects. And today I'll get to hear what we covered in 2024. Very loose timeline here of the projects we covered. You'll see a series of kind of shorter mini projects, and then which can be 2 to 3 meetings. Some minis grow and become 5 or 6, or sometimes one more. But in general, we try to be very clear that we'll keep them short, solve a problem, and move on. And other projects span, 6 months to a year. And today you'll learn about where these projects landed and next steps. And you're going to see a series of speakers across all these projects with different people lead them, and I'll just drive and we'll go from there. So up first, we have patient access brands.
Awesome. So that's me. And this is a project that many folks will be familiar with if you've been tracking work in Argonaut over the past couple of years, although it has a slightly new name, as you'll see in the next slide. But overall, this is a project that started back in 2022 that was focused on making it easy for patient-facing apps to discover information about the different health systems that patients could connect to. And this is one of these kinds of problems that emerges with successful scale of adoption. So we were starting to see the rules in the US for patient access, opening up many connections between patient apps and lots of different health systems. Some of those health systems were well aware of and really presented open arms to these applications. And sometimes health systems had never really heard of these rules and these apps. And so that could create a little bit of chaos. So one of the goals of this project was to try to tame that chaos and present kind of a directory of the different health systems to applications in a way that included the kinds of elements that users would be familiar with. So the name of my doctor's practice, or the logo that that practice uses, or the different addresses and physical sites where they provide care, so that if I was trying to connect my app to my healthcare provider, I'd be able to search for it and find the FHIR endpoints in this kind of a directory. So we kind of shaped that into the idea of branding information to give health systems or healthcare providers a way to surface their own brands inside of patient-facing applications. And through a couple rounds of iteration, we worked together with a set of EHR vendors and consumer apps. We ran connectathons, and this year in January, we brought the functionality for user access brands into the ballot for the latest publication of the Smart Implementation Guide. We did a little bit of connectathon testing in March, and then we finalized the specification in time to publish patient access brands in what we call the Smart 2.2 specification. So the connectathon testing that we did this year, Brett, if you don't mind just going forward one slide, that connectathon testing gave us good confidence that the spec was generally working. It also gave us some really good feedback in terms of making sure this spec was useful, not just in the US, but internationally. So it led to the creation of a little bit of additional guidance around listing country codes alongside the physical addresses of healthcare providers. And then we also had some feedback as part of the ballot that it would be better if we thought about branding health systems for patients and other kinds of users as well. That could be patient representatives. It could even be healthcare providers that need to connect to these APIs. So we wound up changing the name and documenting that these same data structures could be used for any user-facing applications. So that's the project as it landed, is titled User Access Brands. And I'm very pleased to say that we've got the first implementations of these APIs already in production today. So these are open endpoints where anybody with a web connection can download a very, very large bundle of healthcare provider information, in this case from Epic and from Meditech. Those are already live. And the idea is that you wouldn't be fetching these giant bundles to your device every time you want to search for a healthcare provider. This is something that applications would typically fetch on some recurring basis and keep synchronized in their own sort of app-specific backend in order to pre-process them and make them available for fast search to their users. So these bundles, the branding information, really is a publication format. The only other thing to point out this year is that patient access brands was included in the set of proposed requirements for certified EHRs. So that was the HTI2 proposed rule that came out in July. We've just seen the first final rule for HTI2, which doesn't get into any of the certification requirements yet. So we don't know quite how that will be finalized, but we're expecting there will probably be another rule that comes out, perhaps in short order, but there's still not exact clarity on when those requirements might come into play. But I'm at least pretty happy and confident that the spec we've got is something that's going to take us forward, whether or not it winds up being finalized in that rule. So next steps really are just continuing to get experience from those current implementations, getting feedback from app developers who are starting to work with these bundles, and then using that feedback to improve and iterate on the spec over time. And Brett, I don't know if we've got time for questions or any quick back and forth at this stage, but happy to answer them here or offline.
Yeah, folks have any? We have a minute. Okay, thanks, Josh. If we have questions, Zulip's the place to be. Up next is Granular Controls, and Eric's going to give us a quick walkthrough. Eric's on mute.
Still muted.
Had to have it.
All right, how's that? How's that? Is that better?
That's good.
Okay, so so for the Granular Scopes mini last year, we introduced Granular Scopes into the US Core ballot last January, and it was designed to meet the STB-ONC's Granular Scope requirements in HTI1. And so in the ballot version, we had requirements for service to support both resource levels and granular level scopes, as defined in the Smart App Launch version 2. But then we after the ballot, we had, based on comments we received, we wanted to go ahead and host several calls to review the scopes, rules, and guidance in US Core with the implementer community before publication of the final version of US Core 7. We anticipate that these versions, and in fact, US Core 7 was named in HCI2, as Josh mentioned, that whether in the draft version, we don't know the outcome of that draft as of today. But we did host 3 calls, and the goal of those calls was to define we wanted to clarify for certifiers and implementation the US Core scopes, because in the ballot version, they did indeed extend beyond what was described in HTI1. So there was some concern about that and some clarifications that were needed. Okay, so we had our 3 calls, and it was very productive. Our project outcomes include we actually published the changes based on this mini in US Core version 7.0.0. You can take a look at it for yourself. And as I said before, it was named in HTI2 as well. We went ahead and expanded the overall guidance. The page originally was just focused on scopes. We expanded that page to give guidance on overall Smart and FHIR obligations and capabilities. So we included a few other things, and there's a link to that page. And then we went ahead and did limit the list of there you go. And then we have, see those shalls in there? Those are things that certification people pay attention to, as well as certifiers and certifiees. And so we limited that to basically what was named or mentioned in, and we kind of mapped what was named in HTI1 to the shells. So then we have some shoulds in there and some mays to give some best practice guidelines as well. And then we also made several clarifications to the guidance and requirements in the guide to clean it up, so we could answer a lot of the questions we had in the ballot. It's pretty short. It's a mini, so it's going to be a little mini presentation on our goals. And we hit next slide here. We kind of, as far as our outcomes, I'm an optimist. I consider the project complete, but we certainly are going to passively track issues with US Core scopes, requirements, and guidance as they arise. We have a new ballot coming out for 2025 for US Core, and oftentimes, actually, you'll see, past version updates be also, commenters looking at the entire guide, and we'll make some comments. So we might see some new comments regarding scopes coming forward, and also we'll look at and see, especially with if HTI2 draft proposals for scopes and using US Core 7 come to fruition, then we'll probably see a few more eyeballs on this issue and may have to go back and revisit some of the guidelines and requirements. But for now, I'm going to consider it complete, and we had a very successful mini project.
Thanks, Eric. What do you think? Just do you want to call out some of the controversy around the Granular Scopes resources and categories?
Can you restate that question? I'm kind of.
Do you want to, I just remember there was starting to think about some things in our project that will carry forward the kind of the granular scopes around categories when a resource has multiple categories present.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you for jogging my memory. Yes, there was a question about, well, if you have, for example, an observation of lots of different categories, and it could overlap. You could have, two categories for the same observation, and so we landed upon that was kind of not clear. So in this year's guidance, we did update that to say, if it's kind of if it meets the bar, if at least one of those categories is in scope. So it's not that you have to meet all categories, but if the scope is granted for a single category, then we'll consider that's the bar that you need to meet to grant access to all observations, for example, that meet that category, even if they have other categories in the observation.
Yeah.
Did I say that correctly? It's kind of confusing.
Yeah, you did, and I look forward to commenting or feedback from folks on the ballot on that topic.
Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
I think we have Gina up now on detecting and reporting changes.
Yeah, how's it going, everyone? Apologies, I'm a little under the weather, so apologies if I sound stuffed up. This was another mini project. We'll start with the pitch here. What problems were we solving? This is the traditional polling problem. So as client apps become more prevalent and there are more servers, clients need to poll more often and more servers, and everyone is sad. So then the clients try to be good citizens and increase the polling times, which of course decreases performance as far as the patients are concerned, because this new prescription was issued yesterday and you didn't tell me till today because you're only checking once a week and things like that. But we also can't be asking servers every 5 seconds because the servers would not like that either. The biggest complication, facade servers in particular, don't really have a way of using this last updated stuff because the resources don't exist. They are generated as they are requested, and so it's not really something that was tracked. And so this is tied to the resource.meta.last updated elements that's on all resources and the search parameter underscore last updated. And I didn't add the note there, but I think one of the other problems is being an underscore search parameter makes people assume it's always there. And that's something that I don't know how to fix some of those impressions that people get when they read the spec. But they're like, well, it's an underscore parameter. Everyone should have it and it should always be there. And that's not at all true. So thanks, Brett. Who needed to participate? Vendors, both sides, servers, clinical app developers, and then success. Understanding the challenges on both sides and building out our guidance for clients and servers for best practices. And then how we were going to continue attacking this in the future, because we knew in a mini we weren't actually going to solve this problem universally. So, next slide, please, Brett. Thank you. What did we actually did? We did a series of meetings. We ended up with 6 from February to April. There were a few gaps in there for things like hymns and etc. A few cycles of out-of-band editorial work. Thank you, Eric. Back and forth on that. There's a link to the notes on Confluence. We have guidance added to US Core v700. That's the link is there as well. And overall, at the end of the day, we came up with a core set of recommendations that we felt were reasonable for both sides and gave the patients the access they need while not being unduly burdensome on servers. And overall, we also said we'd rather punt this to subscriptions. And so we kind of got everyone to say that if we want to do that, then we should do it. And then we also left some open questions on if there are more things that we need to do in this directly. I added this one, just thoughts and reflections. I wanted to comment. I did really feel this type of project was really in the sweet spot for Argonaut. It was a real world issue that we had, the push and pull back and forth. needed to get the vendors all sitting at the table talking about it. And getting that agreement was more critical than output artifacts in particular, which we tend to prefer not needing to publish tons of stuff to get our agreements done. And we achieved everything. So I just wanted to say thank you. There were some contentious points as we were discussing them. And I really appreciated the open, candid, and polite discussion that we managed to have, and most of all productive. And so yeah, I think with that, we kick it over to the thing we committed to doing, which is subscriptions feed. And Josh, I believe that is you want to discuss that, right?
Yes, I will take the handoff. Awesome. So these projects were closely linked in spirit. There was a couple months that came in between when we wrapped up our discussions about Last Updated and kicked off some work on subscriptions. And it's worth saying that the strong instigator for this subscriptions work was this little proposal that came in July as part of HDI2, which laid out many pieces in terms of requirements that certified EHRs would need to have to produce subscriptions data to support subscriptions, and then requirements that public health agencies and others might have in order to be able to consume data through subscriptions. So this project goes back a long time in Argonaut. It's something that when Gino first joined the interoperability team at Microsoft, he took on subscriptions as kind of a core area of focus. And we thought this will be a project for 1 or 2 years. That was back in 2019. And we're still at it, but we are making progress. And so just to highlight some of what's been going on this year, Brett, if you don't mind going on to the next slide. Actually, we can just go ahead. I'll just dig into the nature of the requirements in HDI2. The proposal was quite broad, and so this got us thinking: how are we going to define a couple of topics and expectations for what clients can subscribe to in a way that's going to cover the pretty broad set of data that's in US Core today, but also avoid boiling the ocean? And if you go one slide further, I just want to give you kind of a rough hint of the design that we came to. Sorry, just forward 2 slides from here.
Here you go. Sorry, Josh. Gotcha.
That's the spot. Thank you. So through a lot of discussions, we kind of came up with this pattern that, first of all, acknowledges that there's many different systems architectures for FHIR-enabled health IT. We have many EHR systems that have their own internal data models and highly event-driven systems, which can be a very natural fit for some kinds of subscriptions to be able to notify people when events happen. But we also have cloud-hosted databases with CRUD kind of REST inputs and outputs that are also very natural trigger points for informing systems when data are changing inside. And so the challenge was, how do we take that diverse set of architectures and provide a set of abstractions that clients could depend on that would look consistent across those systems? And I've got a link here to the specification that we wound up drafting over the course of sort of late summer and fall. And the idea is essentially there's a feed that corresponds to US Core, and you can filter it by patient and by resource type. And we left this concept of events fairly wide open to say that when something important happens that's related to a patient or a few key resource types. So we focused on notes, labs, and encounters. Clients would be able to subscribe to changes to those kinds of resources or events that happened related to those resources. So a client can create a subscription that mentions any of those resource types and create a feed for the kinds of events that the EHR is able to surface about them. And we wanted to focus on that narrow set of 4 core resource types to start getting some experience, figuring out how well these APIs are going to work for us. There's also a page in the spec that sort of covers the rest of US Core, which we label as optional. So the idea is servers can get started supporting a pretty small set. And then the interesting sort of other design kind of compromise that happens here is, we know that some systems might just be tracking FHIR data as resources. So if a resource like an encounter gets updated at a certain point in time, that system could broadcast to clients and say, hey, this encounter was updated. But there's other systems that are tracking more clinical semantics to say things like, the patient has been admitted or discharged. And yes, that probably corresponds to some change in the encounter resource, but there's a lot of edge cases. And those correspondences are not always as clear as one might naively think. So what we laid out here was a way to say an event happened as a baseline. And then we also allow servers to layer on more detailed semantics. So if your EHR has a custom event catalog, or if you want to assign V2 event types as labels to these notifications, you can do that right on top of this core protocol, and still allow clients to just follow this basic subscription protocol of saying, I'm interested in any event you can give me, or if there's a more detailed catalog at your site, the client can down select and say, actually, I'm more interested in a certain subset of those events. So next steps here, we had a lot of negotiation to sort of put together these rules, but we need Connectathon testing. And so we've got a plan to do a virtual Connectathon in February, just starting to test out the notifications part of this API. That was the piece of the overall functionality that EHRs felt most ready to test the soonest. So we'll see how this goes. And of course, we'll also see what kind of requirements, if any, land in the HTI2 final rule, and that'll help focus future work on this one. Again, happy to answer questions if there are around the subscriptions feed topic. Otherwise, I think it's me up next talking about glucose monitoring. So this was sort of one of the more domain-specific problems that we've taken on. Often in Argonaut, we do core infrastructure, things like authorization, security, access patterns, and so on. But for a few years running, we've had some project relating to increasing capabilities for writing data into EHR systems. So we did one a couple years ago on allowing applications to write small bits of state into the EHR to persist their own application-specific settings or configuration. We did one last year that was focused on vital signs. And in some ways, this is an extension of, or a natural progression of that work, which was focusing on sharing glucose data between external systems and an EHR. And over the course of this project, I certainly learned a lot about how glucose measurements happen with CGM devices. I learned a fair bit about the hardware and some of the software platforms where glucose data are managed, and some of the existing integration patterns for those data with EHRs. And what we set out to solve here was really submitting details from a patient's at-home monitoring using a continuous glucose monitor device to be able to submit those details into an EHR. And we knew from the beginning that would cover kind of a spectrum from unstructured data, like just a PDF report, all the way up to granular CGM readings that happen roughly once a minute or once every 5 minutes, depending on the particular device and settings. And one of the great things about this is that when we started this project, there had been previous excellent detailed work figuring out sort of the clinical value proposition and exactly what data elements and fields were worth being able to communicate about. So we were able to start from this previous report that had been published, which didn't get into the interop specifics, but it laid out all the domain expectations for a core data set to be shared in this glucose domain. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, Brett, we put together, to my mind, a really great group for this project, which included some of the hardware manufacturers, some software developers that build glucose management platforms that provide clinical decision support, and of course, EHR vendors who were some of the first to propose this project in Argonaut as we got started. And when we were first putting this project together, we figured we'd put together some guidelines for sharing glucose data, and maybe that could land in US Core, maybe starting on the futures page of US Core. If you don't mind going to the next slide, as we were first getting started on this project, learning about the intensity of the needs here, it became clear that these were not US specific problems. The challenges that we were hearing about were really international in scope. And reading through the iCode report that I mentioned from 2022, it became clear that it was worth having guidance that could be followed more broadly. We did a bunch of background interviews. If folks are interested in learning along with us, there's links to some of those which we recorded on YouTube. And then if you go to the next slide, now we get into kind of the pattern that wound up developing as we started our round of consensus phone calls. So I mentioned early on, there were some requests to take this work and think about it as an international realm project. So the current implementation guide, you'll see it on the FHIR build server, lives in the HL7 org. So it's sort of on track to be something that we can bring into ballot next year if everything goes according to plan. And the basic pattern that we focused on was an external application, which can be a Smart on FHIR app, connecting to the EHR, learning about which patient it needed to submit data for. And there's a couple ways that could happen, but most commonly that might be a smart app launch with patient context. So by the time the app is done launching, the EHR informs it that we're talking about patient 1, 2, 3, and here's all the demographics that the app could use in order to sanity check the set of data that it's going to be sending over. And we defined a pattern where the app can submit data at sort of regular intervals, because this lines up with the requirements that many health systems have in terms of how often they want to review data. So sometimes that might happen on a schedule, and sometimes it might happen just in time, like when the patient shows up for an appointment. And so we provided a couple of ways for apps to know when they should submit data. That could be a manual trigger, or it could be what we call a standing order that the app can read in the patient's record that might say, we want to get 1 month glucose histories, and we want to receive them every 2 weeks, something like this. And then the app can follow along those submission guidelines and prepare a bundle of glucose data that it posts into the EHR. And that's the primary access pattern that we focused on. But we also developed a set of guidance for using smart health links in scenarios where the EHR and the source of glucose data are not so tightly integrated. So maybe the receiving system in that case could be something like a summer camp, and they don't have like a full certified EHR system, but they have some kind of health data management platform that they're using. And maybe there's no way to register an OAuth client with it. But with smart health links, a patient or a camper or their family could share a link that's something like what I'll paste into the chat here, that could simply display data, or also provide a way to get a FHIR bundle if you do have an interoperable kind of FHIR-enabled system. So this is a project where we wound up developing a set of data profiles that go pretty deep in terms of the glucose reporting. So one of the sort of roadblocks that we hit along the way was making sure that we had the right set of link codes attached to all the various summary statistics that you might want to share with glucose values. And a shout out to Eric, who helped chase some of these down with Regenstreif. We've now got almost all of the link codes that we need allocated for these concepts. And we were able to run a Connectathon this November, which was a pretty successful event. We had participants from the EHR side. We had 3 different certified EHR systems participating and testing these ideas out. We had hardware manufacturer and glucose development platform, and got good feedback, which has already landed a few changes to the specification, particularly around things like helping clients avoid the submission of duplicate data. So sometimes you have a really smart client, which is like a back-end, very sophisticated system that's maintaining all kinds of state about which glucose values have already been shared with the EHR. But sometimes you have a client that is maybe a lower capability set where it knows all the measurements that it's taken, but it doesn't have a lot of state to synchronize, and it just might try to send a whole batch of glucose values over and over again, and that could lead to duplication of data. So we've, based on the Connectathon feedback, started putting together some better guidance about strategies for avoiding that duplication. And if everything goes according to plan, this is a project that the HL7 Orders and Observations Workgroup has officially taken on. We've got an implementation guide proposal that's been approved, and the plan is to bring this into ballot for the May cycle of next year. We've got a few open issues in our spec, but I think we're at the point where the content itself and the workflow patterns have gotten pretty stable. So that's the CGM overview.
Thanks, Josh. I think Dan's up next.
Sounds good. Thanks, Brett. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the bulk optimize project, which was an attempt to take a look at what we've learned over the last couple of years on the bulk data access implementation guide through implementations and folks starting to use it, and see if we could improve the spec with some of that knowledge. And so the overall problem is, and I don't know if I would necessarily categorize this as a problem versus an optimization, which is why we named it that. But you have a lot of use cases around mandated reporting, like UDS Plus is doing, public health, CDC has several bulk data projects, quality measurement in terms of pulling in large amounts of data to calculate quality measures, research use cases where people want to export data to be able to run NLP models on it or analyze it to understand a cohort of patients. They have like all these use cases where you want to pull data on a large cohort. And so far in the spec, we focused a lot on kind of getting the basic capabilities working and making sure that the output can be efficiently loaded into a data warehouse or a data environment. And so there's an opportunity to look at the other side and try to figure out if there are ways we can update the spec to make it easier to make performance servers that are able to generate data more efficiently or to export the data more efficiently. And also, some of these use cases don't really need the data organized by resource type. They really want to look at one patient at a time. So that's certainly true for quality measurement. And also, there's some public health use cases that work like that. And so in those cases, you really want to be able to organize the data by patient instead of FHIR resource. And so there are existing solutions to this. You can sometimes add hardware and scale up. You can export as CSVs, which is sometimes faster, and convert to FHIR. Some people are just taking several weeks to do exports, which works for some use cases. And you can, in terms of organizing by patient, you can load the data into a data warehouse and then kind of restructure it yourself. But that's a little bit inefficient. So these were the general problems we set out to solve. And so on the next slide, Brett can talk about what we actually managed to do. So we came up with about 11 potential enhancements to bulk, and then had a couple meetings where we went through those, added some, and then voted. Each member kind of ranked their top projects, and 3 projects emerged with a pretty big consensus that these were the most important ones. So we chose to focus on 3 different work streams to improve the spec. And I'll talk a little bit about where we landed on each one. The first is the type filter parameter. So type filter we added as an experimental parameter in the spec, mostly because we didn't have implementations to test with kind of prior to publishing the bulk data IG. Now that's changed. There are production implementations from Epic and Cerner and a lot of other FHIR servers, including Happy and I believe the Microsoft FHIR server. So lots of implementations, but our documentation in the spec was a little bit loose in terms of which search parameters are supported and exactly how the interactions work between repeating the parameter versus adding additional criteria within a type filter parameter, and how it interacts with other parameters like underscore type and underscore since, type and underscore since, as well as include associated data, things like that. So we wanted to really clean up the documentation, make sure everyone's on the same page. And so that's what we focused on in this project. We also threw in a little bit of capability documentation, so you can specify in your capability statement which search parameters are supported for type filter versus potentially other searches on your server. We didn't go too deep on that intentionally because capability statements are a little hard to get really granular with, and there's work on kind of revamping that in FHIR. So I think we'll take another pass at that once that's a little further along. But there's enough capability to kind of give clients hints about how your server works. And then I'll just add this other point. There's Argonaut actually put together some additional guidance on using capability URLs. So that's URLs that directly access a file without authentication, so that some servers wanted to be able to put exported files in cloud buckets with a high entropy URL and put that URL into their export manifest. And so we had guidance on that. And so we just folded that into the spec. So it's all in one place now, but there wasn't really a change in that piece. And then the work stream that we spent the most time on was this organizing output by patient. That's a little bit of a misnomer. It's really organizing output by instances of a resource type. We focused mainly on patient because that's where most of our use cases lie, but there was also interest in making sure this could work for things like organizing by an organization for a provider directory, where you might want all your provider information kind of to be able to be sucked in by organization rather than by patient or something else. And so we added some parameters to support that. And what it does is, instead of exporting a file per resource type or multiple files per resource type, but one resource type per file, we instead get a series of kind of all the resources for a patient grouped together in files with a header that identifies the patient whose data follows. So you can still put multiple patients in a bulk data file, in an NDJSON file or some other format. So you can get kind of the efficiency of having a smaller number of large files, but now you can kind of process all of the patient's data without having to load it somewhere. And as part of this, we also added 2 other features. We added support for partial manifests so that if you, right now, when you're doing an export, you have to kind of wait for all the files to be generated before a client can view the manifest and start downloading them. As part of this work, we added the ability for a server, if a client requests it, to pass a partial manifest back to the client as files are generated. So if you have files for like, you know, your first 1,000 patients, you can pass that to the client. And then as you generate files for the next 1,000 patients, you can add a manifest with that additional information. So it lets clients start downloading the data faster. Of course, a client could ignore all that and still just wait until the whole export is done and then download the data. So it's pretty backward compatible in that way. And then we also added paging to manifest. So this hasn't really been a problem in real world scalability, but it's certainly a theoretical problem. So we wanted to make sure we covered it. And that was if you have, let's say, 1 million files that are generated from your bulk export, putting those in one JSON manifest might mean that some clients can't parse it because it's too big a JSON object. And so with this paging, it kind of works the same way as paging bundles, where you kind of get a next link at the end of one manifest. And if you follow that, you get kind of another manifest. And we looked at a lot of different options for how to structure this and ended up with something that was fairly simple. The last piece I'll mention about this is that if there's a resource that applies to multiple patients, like if you're exporting practitioner information that's associated with patients, so like their PCP, that practitioner resource might appear in a number of patients. And we looked at different ways to address that, and then finally decided that the simple way is probably best, which is just repeat it under each patient where it's applicable. So you might get more data if you organize output by patient than you would get if you organized output by resource, but you get the benefit of being able to kind of process without having to worry about what's in other files. And then the last work stream was around criteria-based group creation. And so this is addressing an issue where if you, let's say, want to export data only on diabetic population at your healthcare institution for quality metrics, let's say, quality measure calculation. Right now, if you want to get that population, you have to kind of go into the front end in each EHR and create a FHIR group off of registry information or export a list of patient IDs and create a group that way. And so this is kind of a pretty manual step, and there's not necessarily a standard way to do it across EHRs. And so for criteria-based group creation, we added an API and a profile on top of group to standardize how you could create these groups programmatically. So just like you can use type filter to filter resources to filter the output by the content of the resources being output, here you can filter the content by filter the output by patients who have specific criteria. So you're creating kind of dynamic groups, and then you export all the data for patients in those groups. So I think it's kind of a neat capability. It's maybe one of the a little less tightly specified than organizing output by patient. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where people land as we start to do implementations of that. And then Brett, in terms of implementations, we're hoping or planning to have a virtual connectathon on February 10th to start testing out these capabilities in one or more work streams. So if you have a client or a server and you're planning to implement support for one or more of these changes, it'd be great to have you participate. And then as we identify kind of any issues or things that are still rough in the spec, I'm hoping we'll have some refinements to the implementation guide coming out of that. And then potentially, depending on how the Argonaut steering committee wants to proceed, we could then ballot these changes this year during one of the ballot cycles so that they're kind of formalized and part of the spec. So if you're interested, I put some resources here. This is a link to the Argonaut branch of the bulk export or bulk data access implementation guide with all these changes. There's the SMART team at Boston Children's Hospital is working on a reference implementation that hopefully will be done by the virtual Connectathon, so folks who are building clients can use that for testing. And then lastly, we had endless discussions about a lot of these features and weighed pros and cons of different approaches. And so there are meeting notes at that link that detail a lot of that. So I think I might have gone a little over time, so sorry about that. But happy to take questions if we have a minute, or we can keep moving, Brett, if for tight on time.
No, we can pause for a moment.
I think a lot of the folks on the line were involved in these discussions and contributed some of the approaches. So I guess I'm not shocked that there aren't a lot of questions.
Thanks, Dan. I think up next is Eric, and have no fear. We'll post this video, and I'm sure there'll be other questions after. So Eric, you're up on USCDI. If you want to pop off mute. Even with the suggestion, Eric, still not on mute. You're still on mute.
Okay, how's that? All right. So yeah, so here is our CDI version 5 design sprint. We call it a sprint. I feel like it takes half my year, but nevertheless, we do this. We've done this now how many years in a row? I think probably 5. Where we take the latest version of USCDI and we look at it, get consensus, and we come up with a new version of US Core at the end of it. So the objectives here is to create US Core profiles to meet the ASTP ONC's USCDI V5 requirements. And we want to do this based on industry feedback. And this helps us seed initial design. This project helps seed the initial design for our next version of US Core. And then this is also an opportunity. We're starting earlier, so we have more of an opportunity. It's also a great opportunity to provide some good feedback back to ASTP ONC on their USCDI requirements. Okay, so our goals, and this is our goals every year. We want to define the minimum set of requirements for each of the US Core profiles to meet the clinical use as well as certification requirements. And I want to stress minimum. We don't try to over-specify. And that allows for further standards development for specific use cases by other implementation communities. And these US Core profiles, I'm proud to say, are used by a lot of other implementation guides as a jumping off point for further refinement. And certainly we want to design our profiles to leverage existing work where it's available. An example that would be with a coverage resource. We had lots of existing work to look at, so we didn't start from scratch. In some other cases, we have to start from scratch. And then I'm not done yet. There's a couple of singles. Okay, so one of our goals also is to have a single set of proposals that we can start to propose to the broader HL7 community in our design discussions, and then ultimately publish these profiles in US Core. So next slide, please. Okay, so the solution, and I think it's a key. The first one, I put this up at the top because I was looking at the slides, and we get industry participation. This is really key. So we got EHR vendor support, health systems, and other stakeholders to give us really excellent feedback on these. We kick off earlier than in previous years. We started kicking off these things in May, so we draft some proposals and start online discussions already in May based on the draft USCDI version. So it hasn't reached final status. In the past, we tried to start after the final USCDI version dropped, but I think we've had a better process by getting ahead of the curve, because one of those things we talked about earlier gives us a chance to give some useful feedback to ONC. So if we had a face-to-face meeting in the work group as well as online design sessions, and after USCDI is published as a final, which is sometime in July, we start a series of our 10 meetings armed with our drafts, and we try to hammer them out for presentation to the HL7 community at the September working group meeting. And then all our unfinished work and trackers and so forth are completed on HL7 sponsored calls through the fall. And so, and finally, we have the USC design work is incorporated into US Core and is published, and we're going to have one coming up in the January 2025 ballot, US Core 8. Okay, so the next steps, well, we're going to publish it, like I said, it's upcoming. Then we track those ballot reconciliation and publication of US Core. We go from the ballot to the US Core version 8, and typically we publish that in the 1st of May. And then we may consider, like we did last year for scopes, we have some areas where we may want to consider having a mini, where we feel there's lack of community consensus, or maybe we need to do a little more testing. And so we have author provenance, maybe one, and ADI. Those are just question marks because we don't know. Maybe it'll fly through and everybody will love the design, and we'll just go ahead and publish as is. But if not, then we have this other bite at the apple through Argonaut to help refine some of these more contentious things. And the other next step is to start beginning planning for US CDI version 6 whenever that comes out as draft, and then we restart the whole cycle again for the next version of US Core, which happens to be version 9. And we might start considering publishing based on FHIR R4, looking forward, R4-based guides as well as R6-based guides, eventually transferring over to R6 as the industry decides to go to FHIR R6. And then there's a scary diagram that we have here. So you see we're at 2025. You see that column, US Core 8, US CDI version 5. Next version, depending when that comes out, we'll have a US CDI 6, and then we might consider at that point making R6 base guide. That's not written in stone. That's just, the first plausible year where we would do that. We might push it back depending on our feedback from the community.
Yeah, and this is a big scary slide produced by Steve Posnack and myself at HL7 US Rome Steering Committee. This dual release in 2026, I think, is up for debate, and I think there may be an Argonaut project to kind of refine a bit about how we handle a transition between R4 and R6. So stay tuned. R6, of course, isn't finalized. The FHIR R6. Well, the date has shifted many times, but this will definitely be something we're kind of looking to how we will handle supporting the industry transitioning between the different FHIR releases. But it's clear we are not ever going to do anything on FHIR release 5 for US Core. Policies, any questions for Eric? All right, we're on international patient access, and Isaac, you're up.
Thanks, Brett. If you can you stop your presentation and then restart it to catch any changes since you started? And then, hey everybody, my name's Isaac Vetter. Work on Epic, but more applicable, I help lead the International Patient Access Project within HL7. So international patient access is the idea that we can look globally across the world at all of the FHIR patient access specifications and national cores and identify and define a minimum set of data elements and interactions that multiple countries can use in common, such that things like patient apps work between in different countries, such that FHIR servers can deploy the same functionality in different places, as well as for various kind of jurisdictions and nations to kind of build on top of the work that the rest of the world has already done, and to deploy like successful FHIR API capabilities. So that's kind of generally the problem that IPA tries to solve. So I've got it written up here as proliferation of disparate FHIR specs. So we published IPA STU1, I want to say last year, with the help of Argonaut and Eric Haas's superb world-class IG authoring abilities. We've also got a 5-minute of interoperability introduction to IPA here. So if you just do a Google search, you'll come up with this nice short little YouTube video that John Diamore put together. Next slide, please. So with the publication of IPA STU1, we kind of had the idea of well, now we've got this thing. How do we actually reach out and talk to other nations or other jurisdictions, and how do we make it more available and more well-known and kind of advertise or market this capability and this vision and this tool that nations can use to better enable digital health, accessed for their citizens and consumers. And so we kind of identify these goals of, really we want the national standards bodies, national FHIR cores to build on top of IPA as a goal to as a method, as a mechanism of ensuring or working towards FHIR compatibility across national boundaries, as well as just the broader availability of patient apps. Next slide, please. And we've seen a little bit of success there so far. So for example, we've got the Finnish FHIR base implementation guide, inherits and builds on top of IPA. Next slide. As does, oh, there we go. And then when Australia Core's publications have also really expertly kind of done this kind of deep analysis between the implementation guide that they are publishing and continue to work on against IPA as well as IPS and even US Core. Next slide. The third kind of example here is we've seen the Vulcan FHIR Accelerator. They have a real-world data implementation guide that's specifically intended to be kind of a universal realm guide, targeting not just the US, but also Europe and other jurisdictions for feeding data into research efforts. And because of the kind of similar goals of IPA, they actually built their implementation guide on top of IPA as well. So these are just a few examples of places where we have seen, at least in the standards world, we have seen reuse and kind of growing mindshare of IPA. However, this is just, these are just a couple of examples. We really want this tool, want IPA to be used a lot more broadly. Next slide. So the idea here is like, well, what we need to do is start to market to regulators, market to these jurisdictions, in order to kind of make sure that this tool is better known to them. So a pretty unusual Argonaut project, I think. Argonaut said, well, I think we'll just fund the creation of a website, of a public-facing kind of like consumer-grade website with an audience of those jurisdictions, people like Ministry of Health people, policy people, even technical, national health IT interoperability people. So with Argonaut's funding, we actually sent out a couple of RFPs and got a response back from a few different web design firms, and ended up kind of contracting with this firm called Built Mighty that I think the FHIR community has had a little bit of experience with in the past, successful experience with in the past. So starting in September or October, they've been working with the IPA work group to kind of flesh out and design and develop this consumer-facing website. We're actually about the last month of that project, so we've got a go-live date of mid-January, and we actually have the user acceptance testing phase of the project kind of starting within the next week or two. One of the things that we're actually putting on that website, we're hoping to put on that website, maybe not initially at go live, but over the course of 2025 at some point, is some type of directory of both, locations or organizations like health systems, labs, pharmacies, payers, whatever it is, organizations that host a production FHIR server with APIs and profiles and support for Smart on FHIR that are compatible with IPA, so that we can kind of start to assemble a listing of supporting organizations that are compliant with IPA, such that policymakers as well as just patients can maybe identify and find organizations that are close to them, that are within their country, within their jurisdiction, that offer these APIs. That's one. And then two, similarly, we're also hoping to kind of build up a list of patient-facing apps that can consume FHIR APIs that use the kind of features of SMART that IPA calls out, as well as IPA compliant FHIR profiles. So if that happens to be you, I've got a URL there. I encourage you to go ahead and fill that out. We're kind of still at super early stage, right? We haven't even launched the website yet. We're about a month away from that. But I really encourage you to help contribute to, global interoperability. Quick shout out to like some of the kind of core team that has done work on this project. And I guess any questions? Also, if you have questions, we run an IPA work group call once a week. We've got a stream on chat.fhir.org called IPA. And I'm always happy to answer questions individually.
Hey, Isaac, just a quick chat.
Anish.
It's Anish.
Sure.
I think I'm putting a small delegation together to go to India mid-February. So I'll anyone that wants to kind of maybe be a part of that, let me know, and I'll happily bring you in. I'd love to get them involved in this.
Okay, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Isaac. Okay, this brings us to the end of the 2024 Argonaut project summary review. We don't make the FHIR APIs you deploy, we make them better. The team is here. It's funny to call it the team. It's really who to reach out to. The Argonaut community is much larger than the 5 folks. Of course, Isaac led the initiative this year. And so it's all about the dozen of you who are still on the phone here today. And of course, anyone who watched this video and gives us feedback on our specs, that's what makes them real and improve the lives of patients around the world. So with that, we'll call it a close. Thank you all, and we'll hope to see you on a future initiative call.